and welcome to our session on doing ethnography remotely. I'm Sylvia Nagisako, professor of anthropology and co-director of the Center for Global Ethnography. Today, I'm speaking with John L. Jackson, Jr., the Walter H. Annenberg Dean of the Annenberg School for Communication and professor of communication, anthropology, and Africana studies at the University of Pennsylvania. Dean Jackson will be speaking to us about his use of digital methods and doing ethnography remotely in several projects, beginning with his doctoral dissertation on Harlem and moving on to his later research on the Hebrew Israelites of Jerusalem. So we are so pleased to have you here with us, Dean Jackson, and we're just going to start right away and ask you about how you've used digital tools for ethnographic research.
When I think about my own use of what we might imagine to be digital tools, digital technology, digital methods, maybe the three different kinds of examples I bring up, and I'll try to do them very, very quickly. The first one I think comes out of the way I approached my dissertation, which turned into the first book on Harlem. And back then, I was really keen on talking about Harlem as what I called a quotation marked off place, as this space that existed beyond the geographical boundaries of northern Manhattan, where it was physically located. That there's a version of what people think, almost no matter where you are in the world. Harlem is this kind of famous, one might even say infamous space, racialized space of American urban belonging and community that for me was just as ethnographically important to try to capture as a researcher as that space in northern Manhattan where I was doing a lot of my field work. And so part of what that meant was I felt like I was seeing and researching Harlem almost everywhere I went. So I would go down to Jamaica to do work or to even just vacation, and you could see the specter of people's assumptions about Harlem standing in for African-American difference operate there. The newspapers would be online. The Harlem weeklies would be there. No matter where I was, I'd try to check and see how Harlem was being represented virtually. And that was something that for me helped to concretize this notion that as a field worker, you're thinking not just about the physical space within which you do your interviews and your deep hanging out, but all the kind of the tentacled ways in which all locations we occupy have these multiple levels of almost existential alternative reality. And so for me, this quotation marked off notion of Harlem was a way, maybe flat-footedly, to try to capture the fact that when I was looking for ethnographic data, I wasn't just looking in that space. I was already beginning even this kind of early version of what the internet might mean for ethnographic research, trying to find ways to access Harlem even and especially online and these other kind of modes. And so this quotation marked off notion for me was important back then. And it kind of came roaring to the fore when I began doing work many, many years later on the African Hebrew Israelites of Jerusalem, which was a group that I had started to work with in New York City, in Brooklyn, and in Harlem, but that was really this interestingly transnational spiritual community that was incredibly invested and savvy in its investment in online technology. And so one of the things I would always joke around and tell my students when I was in the throes of that research, and even after I finished it and wrote the book Thin Description, which was an attempt to think about, in a way, how to do remote or virtual or digital ethnography on a group that's as sprawling as this group, 5 continents, all these different interesting satellite communities. Like one of the things I remember telling my students was that there was almost nothing you could see in my book, in the ethnography, that you wouldn't be able to access online, mostly because they're an incredibly purposeful self-archivizing group. And so they're constantly not just recording themselves in audio and video, but putting those recordings up. And so you could go through YouTube and learn so much about the community. I would almost argue, I mean, maybe not quite the same thing you'd learn if you go and spend some time in the Kafar in southern Israel, but you would be able to get a sense of the flavor of the place, the language, the clothing, the interactional dynamics and styles. And so for me, it was funny because I started doing that work with the Hebrew Israelites probably in about maybe it was 1998 or so, 1999, maybe even a little earlier. And for the first 5 years, I was maybe even longer than that. I didn't even think to go online and see what they had, just because that wasn't sort of how I had been taught to do ethnography. I was working with the members of the community I knew in the spaces and locations I could access physically. And it was only after I started to talk to students about my own use of video vis-a-vis that community that I said, well, let me go online and see what they've already put up. And I was flabbergasted by just the sheer volume of material. And the joke at the time was, well, what's left for an ethnographer to do, right? If people can just type in African Hebrew Israelites of Jerusalem and get all that information, all of that interesting and carefully crafted cultural knowledge about this community, and it's really kind of complicatedly variegated cultural and social variety. What's left for me as a researcher to provide that's different? And so in some ways, I spent a lot of time both thinking about how to use that material online to sort of supplement some of the stuff I had already gathered from 10 years of doing what some might imagine to be more traditional ethnographic research, while at the same time trying to think about the relationship between that material and the stuff that I had gotten from quote unquote firsthand in-person ethnographic engagement. And so the Hebrew Israelite of Jerusalem example is a powerful one for me, because it reminds me that part of what we're doing isn't simply about trying to reproduce the versions of ethnographic chronicling or categorizing or representing that might have been most prominent in the early part of the 20th century, but actually to recalibrate what we think ethnography requires, demands, entails in an environment where people don't need the ethnographer anymore to access the quote unquote other. And so for me, thinking through the African Hebrew Israelites of Jerusalem was a nice version of that. And I think for me, the third example, I told you I'd give you three and then stop, actually also goes back to the work I used to do in Harlem and Brooklyn when I first started doing ethnographic research. And at the time, I spent a lot of a psychic energy trying to figure out how to incorporate media making, how to incorporate digital filmmaking into my ethnographic practice. And so actually, I wrote a short article called Ethnographic Film Flam, which was about my attempt to integrate videography of filmmaking into my ethnographic experiences in the field. And for me, even at the time, it wasn't about saying, well, how is I going to produce a multimodal dissertation? I wasn't even thinking about that. Our students are doing that now, but that was light years away from where we were back in the 90s. I mean, for me, it was really about how can I use the skill I had as a filmmaker to, in a sense, give something back to my research subjects, right? I was taking, using all of this data to build an academic career, to make an argument about the world for the academy. And so being able to say, put together a short, 10-minute video birthday tribute for someone's daughter, or a graduation video that was just for them. It wasn't for ostensible ethnographic utility. It wasn't for colleagues. It wasn't for the academy. It was me trying to say, well, at least I can be useful in the field and make this a little bit more of a two-way street. So I remember thinking, as I was still doing my dissertation, thinking about how I wanted to continue to use digital technologies, use nonlinear editing to give something back to the folks who I was working with, who clearly, I think, understood that I was there to do ethnographic research. I made it obviously abundantly clear that I was an ethnographer doing social scientific research, but I also wanted, for my own sense of well-being, to feel like I could provide them with something more than just a version of their stories that would circulate beyond their community or beyond Harlem and Brooklyn, where I did the research for the dissertation and the first book. So I do feel like those are three very differently pitched versions of kind of what were the anchors when I started doing ethnography for my own attempt to think about the relationship between traditional ethnographic practice and these other digital modalities or methodologies or sensibilities that I think are integrated into. And I've always been every effort I make to understand what field work means in the context where the field extends beyond the physical parameters of the place where I sort of pitch my ethnographic tent.
Thank you. That's a really useful range of information about your three projects. Um, uh, it's obvious that you've thought, deeply and broadly about this. So I think those three examples are really very useful. One thing I was thinking of is perhaps you could say something a bit more about how the use of these methods then fed back on reshaping your research questions. Given that you, for instance, in the second case with the Hebrew Israelites of Jerusalem, did your realization that you had an incredible range of this kind of material available already through YouTube and on the net and so on, did that lead you to reshape the research questions that you were asking in this project?
So I guess what I would say is unequivocally, it's the case that the reality of trying to think about digital technologies, how the internet impacts both the researchers' practice, but also the experiences of the folks one is working with or studying with as internet users themselves, that definitely, I think, had a serious impact on both the kinds of questions I would ask, but also the way I'd go about trying to grope around for versions of answers that felt compelling and useful to people. And so I will say that there's a version of this also that was, for me, at a certain level, especially when I was finishing up in grad school, a little terrifying even, right? Because from one angle, I could convince myself that there was nothing left for me to do or say as a researcher, right? I mean, if so much of the material was already accessible in some way, maybe without my own version of contextualization, although sometimes with their own articulation of contextualizing their rituals and practices and beliefs, that I thought was incredibly smart and useful and even anthropologically valuable. There can be a version of the response that can almost make you feel catatonic. Probably the best example, maybe even the most troubling example of this for me, was my use of film and filmmaking. So I told you I studied to be a filmmaker. I was really invested in film technology and using it, especially once we went to digital video recording. It was so much more useful, so much more portable. You wouldn't have to be as precious about the amount you film. Like your whole approach to representing in images and sound ethnographic research was transformed, right, with that move. But I also felt like in that moment, I didn't know what was left for me to record when I really started to exhaustively go through the incredible amount of material that was already put up, either by the community themselves or just as often by folks in the larger public sphere who wanted to demonize the community, who wanted to represent them as pathological, as dysfunctional, as irrational. So these two kind of competing overall approaches to representing Hebrew Israelite culture and practice online, either one as kind of completely sort of demonizing and disparaging the odd beliefs of this spiritual community, the other an attempt to justify what they knew, members of the community knew, might at first glance seem like odd decisions for members of the African diaspora who are interested in community and political possibility to be incorporated into their everyday practices. And so looking at that, one response, and I don't think it's the right response, but I can understand why I had it at the time, was to say, wow, like there's nothing left for me to do as a videographer, which meant I never did any ethnographic filmmaking in that sense with the community. I worked with them on their projects, which was also very valuable and useful. But I never imagined or couldn't find a way to wrap my head around my own individual attempt to make a contribution using my sort of digital video background and skills on the work or in the work I was doing with that group. But that being said, I do think there's another version of how this informed a lot of the decisions that I made as a researcher that made me always push myself to think about a version, I think, of what Kara Keeling uses. So she has this wonderful, I think, critique of notions of sort of progress, of advancement in knowledge production, in civilizationality, that for her is about trying to use a notion of the digital as a way to represent the kind of non-linear nature of how we experience life, or how we gather knowledge, how we understand ourselves and our relationship to the community. And so for her, I mean, she wants to argue there's a version of this inability to predict the future, this the unexpected nature of how life evolves and unfolds over time, that for her was very different from a linear model of progress and achievement that the West, especially the modern West, seemed to bank on. And so for her, that was a version of what a kind of counter narrative steeped in Africana, African American marginalization allowed the digital to bring to the fore. So for her, once you go digital, you recognize there's almost a kind of interesting power and utility in non-linearity, in being able to think about all the ways in which a story can move, that isn't just A to B to C all the way to Z, but that actually relishes the idea that it moves in fits and starts, that you can't anticipate what the next move will be, or how the journey will unfold. And for me, there's a version of her notion of the digital linked to this prioritizing of non-linearity that for me was always how I experienced ethnographic research, right? We tie it up in a neat ball at the end and use our ability to retrospectively give it a kind of easy narrativity in a way that often occludes just how jumbled and chaotic and terrifying ethnographic practice can be in real time, right? And so there's a version of that that also meant, for me, I wanted to try to capture that nonlinearity in the ways in which I rendered my ethnographic material. And that there's a version of doing research, doing field work that actually had its, I don't know, its potency, its value and its utility in that very unexpected nature of what the next ethnographic turn might be. This version of the power and the epistemological significance of chance, what Michael Taussig might call chance, that for me was always embedded in, intrinsic to my notion of what it meant to get excited about fieldwork. And I think this notion of a digital turn, thinking about digitality in the way Kara Keeling laid out, allowed me to embrace that as a way to approach fieldwork in a way that didn't just assume I was trying to get across this very straightforward, easy to lay out landscape, but that my job was to actually sort of revel in all of the complicated and unexpected turns that ethnographic research would take. And there's a version, I think, for that. Maybe it's a little bit of a quirky, idiosyncratic way to think about it, but that model, and I think it's the one Kara Keeling gave me a while ago, still undergirds some of how I think about the excitement and the and the possibilities intrinsic to ethnography that might be a way to define its digital roots in a way that doesn't just fetishize a version of digitality other people might already imagine as linked to the internet, the web, and all these other things that we think are based in a certain notion of technology that might not, I think, always get to the core of what's so distinctive about the current moment. And I think Kara Keeling's more, I think, nuanced and careful understanding of what the digital might imply for how we see the future, about how we gather evidence, about what it means to put that thing, those bits of data together into a narrative, for me was always really powerful.
So this is wonderful because it gives us, I think, a sense of not just the difficulties we face in this period when many people are starting to think about how to do ethnography remotely, but the promise and the opportunity, not just in terms of the methodological tools, but conceptually, rethinking what we think we're doing in ethnography. So I think that's really useful. Obviously, one of the reasons we're doing this is that we have not both faculty, but also a lot of graduate students who are thinking through how they're going to face the next few months, which could extend quite far. How are they going to use these kinds of digital methods to pursue their own research, particularly ones who don't necessarily have, let's say, a digital archive already there to refer to? So, do you have any suggestions about how a graduate student interested in starting to do ethnography remotely could use some of these digital methods?
So that's a great question. For me, I would begin, and maybe this is a little counterintuitive and even not helpful, but I wouldn't make too strong a point about the distinctiveness of the digital per se. Like I think our job doesn't change. Our job is to figure out what we can cull from all the various ways in which cultural practice, cultural ideas, beliefs, philosophies, everyday practice, all that stuff in the world. How do we squeeze out of it the things we think we can use to answer questions that either we're passionate about or that drove us to the academy to begin with? And I think for me, the biggest thing is to say, start with what is the lowest hanging fruit, right? So you don't have to imagine, well, because everyone's doing, I don't know, Zoom or Blue Jeans, that I have to figure out a way to do my interviews or to do my ethnographic work using some of this new technology. Maybe that's true, but maybe it starts with saying, well, how do I, going back to this idea of the quotation marked off place, like what's the quotation marked off version of what I'm studying, and how do I get at that? How do I use the media I can access to help me put together this larger example instantiation of what I'm thinking about as the space that I want to occupy as an ethnographic researcher? And I think there's a version of that we would be doing anyway, right? So there's almost no way. I once, maybe a couple of years ago, I asked David Graeber how I was, pumping out all of these interesting books using all this interesting ethnographic material from. And he said, just the internet, right? I mean, everything's online. Everything is there, and I just take my time and I go through it. And I think there's a version of just realizing that even if we're not able to access the quote unquote field in the way we thought we would do it as a dissertator who was planning to go into the field this summer, I think your job is to figure out how the field is already circulating beyond that space and how the folks in the space are themselves online, internet users, and reimagining their sense of community, collectivity, identity as a function of dealing with the very same kind of crisis. And I think knowing it's a two-way street is really important too. There's a version of what two-way street I used to always tell students meant for me, which meant even as an ethnographic researcher, like we now have put ourselves in a position, like we're doing with this interesting workshop you all are putting together, where a lot of the work we do in the academy that used to be kind of off stage and inaccessible to research subjects are now out in the world for everyone to see, right? And for us to feel, in a sense, surveilled. I used to tell people, I used to give talks, and members of the African Hebrew Israelite community, before I would go out to the West Coast or the Midwest, would say, hey, I hear you're giving a talk at X place, and this is the title. What's the spin you're giving on the material now? And part of what I think for me is so interesting and even empowering about that, it's also scary, but what's empowering about it is there's a version of what our research subjects are able to access vis-a-vis us backstage. That's a certain kind of, not a complete leveling of the playing field in terms of power dynamics and relations, but it's a version of what it means to think about the researcher as an object to be gazed on by the erstwhile research subject. That's really interesting to play with. And I think there's a dynamic there that almost no matter where you're working or what you're working on or what community you're working with and in, the Hebrew Israelites, for instance, happen to be incredibly invested in new technology and much more sophisticated in the usage of it than I am. But even communities that don't have their level of investment and commitment in digital methods, in sort of newfangled online internet-based communication, can still, I think, allow us to see them doing their work differently if we would just be open to the idea that we shouldn't set up a kind of hard and fast line, I think, between the digital and the analog. I mean, there's W.J.T. Mitchell, I think, does a very nice job of arguing that, what we call the digital is always, from a certain perspective, simply the analog that gets reimagined in this much differently sort of binary way, and that your job is to constantly be able to toggle, in a sense, back and forth between how to look at this experience, look at an image, look at a cultural practice digitally and non-digitally at one and the same time. And I think being able to approach fieldwork or ethnographic research in that way is probably important, which is to say, clearly doing something by way of a Google search or web scraping isn't the same thing as pitching a tent in an erstwhile village somewhere, but trying to figure out what ways you can analogize, I think, those experiences and pull from one interesting sort of coefficients or interesting simulations of versions of what you'd see in the other, can sometimes just be good ways to spark interesting questions for yourself as a researcher and actually see versions of the field work landscape in ways that might be really useful and might get you to interesting places. So I guess that's a long-winded way to say it. I think it doesn't matter if you have a film background, if you already imagined there was an obvious way to get to your field site digitally. I think our job now is to recognize that all of these tools are at our disposal. We're doing ethnography all the time. Everything is ethnography. And so that hasn't changed. What's changed is we have to figure out, kind of strategically, what are the best ways to take advantage of the things that are maybe easiest to access now and to see the aspects of the space you're going to do your research in from this vantage point. At some point, maybe you'll be able to sort of test it against another perspective. You'll be able to get on it once you do get in the field, whenever that is. But that field is always above and beyond and extending far outside of just the space where you imagine you're going to take a plane or boat or train to and do some research for 12 months. And I think being willing to say that's not a cop-out, that's just not I would say the future of us all. I think it's the present of us all. And it's a present I find really interesting. And I think for students, part of what it means is I think your advisors, your dissertation advisors can and cannot always be super helpful in helping you to anticipate some of what's going to be most challenging about this moment. And that's okay too, because you'll then be able to teach the field, to move the field in new directions as we continue to reinvent what ethnography is and what kind of contributions anthropology can make to these sort of larger social science and humanities-based conversations. And I think that's exciting stuff.
Thank you. That is really very useful. And we look forward to the question and answer period and seeing, what the students themselves come up with in terms of thinking through some of the suggestions that you have made. Thank you so very much.
Thank you for inviting me, and thanks for doing this. And hopefully I can hear some of the questions during the Q&A session. That sounds great.